What is good, everybody? Welcome back to another episode brought to you by the League FFB. Today, as usual, we are going to be going through our Week 4 rankings at the wide receiver position. The running back position is going to be coming later today, so make sure you are subscribed to this channel. That way you don't miss that video when that one comes out. But like I said, we're going through the wide receiver rankings in today's video, the top 36 here in Week 4. So without wasting any more time, let's hop right into today's video. Let's start talking about these wide receivers. So as you can see, I have the tier maker pulled up on the screen as we speak. I have 7 tiers to get through all 36 wide receivers here in today's episode. So we will start at tier 1, coming in with my number 1 overall wide receiver. That is going to be CeeDee Lamb of the Dallas Cowboys. He plays on the road at the New York Giants in this week's matchup. Now, last week he recorded 4 catches on 7 targets for 67 yards, while also losing a fumble in Sunday's 28-25 loss to the Ravens. Now, it wasn't the performance that you wanted from Lamb last week. That being said, this week against New York, it should be a great chance to bounce back and still produce those elite wide receiver 1 numbers that we have been wanting from CeeDee Lamb. Now, coming in as my wide receiver 2 on the week, that is going to be Marvin Harrison Jr. of the Arizona Cardinals. Now, he plays against the Washington Commanders, and Harrison, he secured 5 of 11 targets for 64 yards and a touchdown in the Cardinals' 20-13 loss to the Lions on Sunday. Marvin has definitely shut down any of the premature Week 1 bust accusations that he got after giving us a very lackluster Week 1. And now he gets a very good Week 4 matchup against the Washington Commanders, who rank dead last against wide receivers in fantasy football. So I am expecting another big week for Marvin Harrison here in Week 4. And now the last player in this top tier of the elite wide receiver ones, that is going to be wide receiver 3 on the week. That is Justin Jefferson of the Minnesota Vikings. He plays on the road at the Green Bay Packers. And Jefferson, he caught 6 of 8 targets for 81 yards and a touchdown in Sunday's 34-7 victory against the Houston Texans. Now, Jefferson, he has 3 straight weeks of finding the end zone, and the Vikings, they look great, man. Jefferson is still a set it and forget it option here in Week 4 against the rival Green Bay Packers. Now we're going to move on to my tier 2. My tier 2 here is going to be the high-end wide receiver 1s. Coming in as wide receiver 4, that's where I'm going to put Rashee Rice of the Kansas City Chiefs. He plays on the road at the Los Angeles Chargers, and last week Rice caught 12 of 15 targets for 110 yards and a touchdown. He also added a 1-yard run in Sunday's 22-17 win over the Falcons. Now Rice has fully established himself as Patrick Mahomes' number 1 target in this offense, and he's accounted for nearly 300 receiving yards through the first 3 weeks of the NFL season. This week's matchup against the Los Angeles Chargers, it isn't going to be the best just due to how slow the Chargers like to play, but Rice, he should still feast on his normal opportunities. Now coming in at wide receiver 5, this is where I'm going to put Amon-Ra St. Brown of the Detroit Lions. He plays against the Seattle Seahawks here this week, and last week St. Brown, he caught 7 of 8 targets for 75 yards and a touchdown in Sunday's 20-13 win over the Cardinals. This week's matchup against the Seahawks, it's going to be tougher than that one. Seattle, they have been one of the stingiest defenses to fantasy football wide receivers this year, but St. Brown, he still is seeing a 31% target share, so volume should be king in this matchup here against the Seahawks. Now coming in as my wide receiver 6 on the week, that's where I'm going to put Nico Collins of the Houston Texans. He gets to play against the Jacksonville Jaguars, and last week Collins caught 4 of 10 targets for 86 yards in Sunday's 34-7 loss to the Vikings. Collins, he didn't have the big day like he had in previous weeks, but he still saw double-digit targets, and he should be one of the best wide receiver plays that you can have here this week against the Jacksonville Jaguars, who are a very soft defense to fantasy football wide receivers. Now coming in as my wide receiver 7 on the week, that's where I'm going to put Jamar Chase of the Cincinnati Bengals. He gets to play on the road at the Carolina Panthers. Now we knew the big week was coming for Chase. He hauled in 6 of 7 targets for 118 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns in Monday's 38-33 loss to the Washington Commanders. That is exactly the type of performance that we have wanted out of Jamar Chase ever since we drafted him in the first round of fantasy football drafts, and he should have a great chance to build upon that performance here in Week 4 against the Carolina Panthers as the Bengals search to find their first win of the NFL season. And now the last player in this tier for me, it is going to be my wide receiver 8 on the week. Here's where we got Malik Nabers, the rookie for the New York Giants. He plays against the Dallas Cowboys, and Nabers caught 8 of 12 targets for 78 yards and 2 touchdowns in Sunday's 21-15 win over the Browns. Now Nabers, he has 2 straight weeks now with top 5 performances, and he looks like an absolute superstar despite the quarterback play of Daniel Jones. He has become a set it and forget it wide receiver play in fantasy football, and I think we're going to leave him there until further notice. Now let's move on to my tier 3. My tier 3 is going to be those low-end wide receiver ones for fantasy purposes. Coming in as a wide receiver 9, I got DK Metcalf of the Seattle Seahawks. He plays on the road at the Detroit Lions, and last week Metcalf, he turned 6 targets into 4 receptions for 104 yards and a touchdown in Sunday's 24-3 win over the Miami Dolphins. DK now has 20 targets in the last 2 weeks and a touchdown in each of those performances, I would expect DK to continue to dominate in this Ryan Grubb offense here in week 4 against the Lions, which is expected to be a fast-paced, high-scoring type of matchup here this week. Now, coming in as my wide receiver 10, this is where I'm going to put Chris Godwin of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. He is playing against the Philadelphia Eagles here this week, and last week Godwin secured 6 of 9 targets for 53 yards and a touchdown in the Buccaneers' 26-7 loss to the Broncos on Sunday. It sure feels like Chris Godwin has surpassed Mike Evans and is now the wide receiver 1 in this offense. I expect him to continue to perform as such in week 4 against a very soft Eagles defense that have been giving up the 3rd most points to the wide receiver position this year. Now, moving on to my wide receiver 11, here's where I'm going to put Brandon Aiyuk of the San Francisco 49ers. He gets to play against the New England Patriots, and last week Aiyuk had 5 receptions on 10 targets for 48 yards in Sunday's 27-24 loss to the Rams. And Aiyuk has been very disappointing through the first 3 weeks of the season, and this week's matchup against New England is projected to be a slower paced game, so I'm not super confident that we're going to get the blow up game, but it should be a good enough game to where he can get back on track and still give us some low end wide receiver 1 numbers. Now, moving on to my wide receiver 12 on the week, this is where I'm going to put Garrett Wilson of the New York Jets. He plays against the Denver Broncos and Pat Surtain. We've talked a lot about it, but last week Wilson, he brought in 5 of 9 targets for 33 yards and a touchdown in the Jets' 24-3 win over the Patriots on Thursday night. Wilson has failed to crack the top 24 wide receivers in fantasy football every single week of the fantasy football season so far, and he has a very tough matchup here this week against Pat Surtain, as I mentioned, and the Broncos. I don't know if this is going to be the week that I am betting on Wilson to hit those wide receiver 1 numbers, but I guess I do have him here as a top 12 guy nonetheless. Now, coming in as my wide receiver 13 on the week, here's where I'm going to put Chris Olave, the New Orleans Saints. He plays on the road at the Atlanta Falcons, and Olave, he gathered all 6 targets for 86 yards and 1 touchdown during Sunday's 15-12 loss to the Philadelphia Eagles. Now, the Saints offense as a whole, it did look like it slowed down a little bit in week 3. That being said, they are going to be looking to get back on track here this week against a very solid Atlanta defense. Now, coming in as my wide receiver 14 and the last player in this tier, it is going to be Mike Evans of the Tampa Bay Bucks. He plays against the Philadelphia Eagles, as I mentioned, but Evans, he brought in 2 of 3 targets for 17 yards in the Buccaneers' 26-7 loss to the Broncos on Sunday. Mayfield, he took 7 sacks in this game, and he only averaged 4.9 yards per attempt. This week's matchup against Philadelphia should be the perfect bounce back territory against a very vulnerable Eagles secondary. Now, let's move on to my tier 4. My tier 4 is going to be those high-end wide receiver 2s, and coming in as my wide receiver 15, it is going to be DJ Moore of the Chicago Bears. He plays against the Los Angeles Rams here this week, and last week Moore caught 8 of 10 targets for 78 yards in Sunday's 21-16 loss to the Colts, and Moore now has a total of 28 targets through the first 3 games of the season, and he continues to be Caleb Williams' first read in this offense. I think sooner than later that volume is going to turn into production, and Moore will look to make that happen here against a very soft Rams defense in week 4. Now, coming in as my wide receiver 16, here's where I'm going to put Devontae Adams of the Las Vegas Raiders. He plays against the Cleveland Browns this week, and Adams recorded 4 receptions on 9 targets for 40 yards in Sunday's 36-22 loss to the Panthers. Adams' struggles due to quarterback play is evident, and that is going to continue to happen. Antonio Pierce has even said something about they're not going to rule out a quarterback switch at some point later this year. It does look like he's going to get Gardner Minshew again this week, but there's a lot in flux here in Las Vegas. I think Adams is going to be the total boom bust option for fantasy football teams moving forward, and he's going to be unreliable because of the quarterback play that he's getting here in Las Vegas. Now, let's move on to my wide receiver 17. Here's where I got Amari Cooper of the Cleveland Browns. He plays at the Las Vegas Raiders this week. Cooper, he caught 7 of 12 targets for 86 yards and 2 touchdowns before he suffered an undisclosed injury late in Sunday's 21-15 loss to the Giants. Now, Coach Kevin Stefanski, he didn't have an update on Cooper's status after the game, but if Cooper plays here this week, which I am expecting him to play, he should have a decent matchup against the Raiders, who are currently ranking 24th against the wide receiver position. And now the last player in this tier for me is going to be my wide receiver 18. Here's where I'm going to have Drake London, who gets to play against the New Orleans Saints. After a disappointing week 1 from Atlanta, Drake London, he's put together 2 straight wide receiver 2 finishes. Obviously, this still isn't meeting the expectation of where you drafted him, but it is looking like positive developments here for Drake London. New Orleans is going to be the tougher matchup here this week, but London, he has seen a 24% target share and 6 red zone targets through 3 weeks for the Atlanta Falcons. Now let's move on to my tier 5. My tier 5 is what I'm going to call the low-end wide receiver 2s. Coming in as my wide receiver 19, I have Jaden Reed of the Green Bay Packers. He gets to play against the Minnesota Vikings this week, and Reed recorded 4 catches on 6 targets for 50 yards in Sunday's 30-14 win over the Titans. He also added 2 rushing attempts for 19 yards as well. Now Reed, he has been operating as the clear wide receiver 1 here in Green Bay for the first few games of the season, and it does sound like Jordan Love is most likely likely going to be back under center here in week 4, which does mean a lot more upside for Jaden Reed in this offense. Now, coming in as my wide receiver 20, this is where I'm going to put Deontay Johnson of the Carolina Panthers, and he gets to play a game this week against the Cincinnati Bengals. Last week, Johnson, he recorded 8 catches on 14 targets for 122 yards and a touchdown in Sunday's 36-22 win over the Raiders. Now, Johnson and this Panthers offense looked much better with Andy Dalton under center, and it looks like Johnson is going to be the biggest beneficiary of a competent offense moving forward, especially now that Adam Thielen is expected to miss some time as well. Now, coming in as my wide receiver 21, here's where I'm going to put Stephon Diggs of the Houston Texans. He gets to play against the Jacksonville Jaguars this week, and last week Diggs caught 10 of 12 targets for 94 yards in Sunday's 34-7 loss to the Vikings. Now, Diggs, he did lead the team in catches, targets, and receiving yards on the day, but Nico Collins, he is still the number 1 wide receiver in this offense. Diggs, he should continue to make an impact as the number 2 wide receiver in this offense moving forward, and he does have a good matchup here this week against the Jacksonville Jaguars. Now, coming in as my wide receiver 22, this is where I'm going to put Tyreek Hill of the Miami Dolphins. Now, he gets to play against the Tennessee Titans, and Hill brought in 3 of 5 targets for 40 yards in the Dolphins' 24-3 loss to the Seahawks on Sunday. The unfortunate thing for Tyreek Hill is he normally would not be in this type of tier based on his talent, but Hill's production is going to continue to be hindered by the bad quarterback play as long as Tua Tagovailoa is out with his concussion, and now Hill will have to play a tough Titans defense in a game with a very low projected game total. Now, moving on to my wide receiver 23, this is where I'm going to put Zay Flowers of the Baltimore Ravens. He gets to play against the Buffalo Bills here this week, and this should be a very fun game. That being said, Flowers, he recorded 3 catches on 4 targets for 20 yards in Sunday's 28-25 win over the Cowboys. This was a very much different result from the previous weeks where Zay was seeing double-digit targets, but this was a rough game for Baltimore, who almost blew a big lead here in this one to the Dallas Cowboys. This Buffalo defense has been very stingy to fantasy football wide receivers, and Zay Flowers, he needs to bounce back here in week 4, but it might be a little bit tough here against this Buffalo defense. Now, coming in as my wide receiver 24, this is where I'm going to put Jameson Williams of the Detroit Lions. He gets to play against the Seattle Seahawks this week, and Williams, he caught 1 of 3 targets for 9 yards, and he rushed once for -7 yards in Sunday's 20-13 win over the Cardinals. It was very weird to see Jameson Williams go from a 20 targets and 228 yards through his first 2 games to being very non-existent here in week 3. But JMO, he still has this big playability, and he can bounce back versus the Seahawks this week on Monday night. Now, coming in at my wide receiver 25, this is where I'm going to put T. Higgins of the Cincinnati Bengals. He gets to play against the Carolina Panthers this week, and Higgins returned from a hamstring injury and caught 3 of 6 targets for 39 yards in Monday's 38-33 loss to the Commanders. Higgins was able to draw enough coverage over to his side to allow teammates Jamar Chase to eat here in this week, but I would expect a bigger day from Higgins here to happen very soon. I think he gets back to full game speed here in the next couple weeks, and this is definitely a player that I'm going to be watching moving forward. Now, coming in as my wide receiver 26, and the final player in this tier, I do have George Pickens of the Pittsburgh Steelers. He gets to play on the road at the Indianapolis Colts, and Pickens caught 5 of 7 targets for 57 yards in Sunday's 20-10 win over the Chargers. Pickens continues to be the clear number 1 in the Steelers offense, but he could really benefit from a better passing offense. Fields is 3-0, and he will likely be the starter moving forward, but that is going to limit the overall ceiling for a guy like Pickens when this offense just isn't throwing for that many passing yards each game. Now, let's move on to my tier 6 here. Tier 6 is what I'm going to call high-end wide receiver 3s. And coming in as wide receiver 27, I have Juwan Jennings of the San Francisco 49ers. He gets a game this week against the New England Patriots, and last week, Jennings, he hauled in 11 of his 12 targets for 175 yards and 3 touchdowns in Sunday's 27-24 loss to the Rams. Jennings was filling in for the injured Deebo Samuel and George Kittle, and he definitely filled their shoes and more for us in fantasy football. He's going to be looking to have another impactful week here in week 4, but I'm not expecting the 46.5 PPR points that he gave us last week. He is still going to be a guy that we can play as a wide receiver 3, though, here in week 4. Now, coming in at my wide receiver 28, this is where I'm going to put Jackson Smith-Njigba for the Seattle Seahawks. Like I mentioned, they play on the road at the Detroit Lions. Smith-Njigba, he finished with 3 receptions on as many targets for 39 yards in Sunday's 24-3 win over the Dolphins. JSN, he really didn't follow up the huge week 2 game in the way that we wanted, but a lot of that can be attributed to the fact that this game got out of hand pretty quickly. And that said, I do expect JSN to have more opportunities to impact fantasy football teams here in week 4 versus the Detroit Lions. Now, coming in at my wide receiver 29, this is where I'm going to put Brian Thomas Jr. of the Jacksonville Jaguars. He plays on the road at the Houston Texans in this divisional matchup, and Thomas, he brought in 5 of 9 targets for 48 yards in the Jaguars' 47-10 loss against the Bills on Monday night. The fantasy production wasn't there just due to the game script and the overall nature of this game, but BTJ, he continues to get more and more involved in this offense each and every week, and I think he could have a good week here against the Houston Texans. And the last player in this tier for me, coming in as my wide receiver 30, is going to be Tank Dell of the Houston Texans. As I mentioned, they play the Jaguars, and Dell, he caught 5 of 6 targets for 62 yards on Sunday and put together his best receiving line of the season, although both Nico Collins and Stephon Diggs still did work ahead of him in the pecking order of this offense. Now, Dell, he's going to be looking to shake off a minor wrist injury and be a high upside wide receiver 3 going into week 4 against the Jacksonville Jaguars. And now moving on to my tier 7. Tier 7 is these low-end wide receiver 3s. Coming in as my wide receiver 31, I got Terry McLaurin of the Washington Commanders. He plays on the road at the Arizona Cardinals, and McLaurin, he brought in 4 of 6 targets for 100 yards and a touchdown in the Commanders' 38-33 win over the Bengals on Monday night. The majority of McLaurin's production, it came on 2 long catches, one of which was a touchdown. So if it were me, I would be selling high on Terry McLaurin, but this matchup versus Arizona should be another high-scoring game, giving McLaurin some potential to make a few more big plays here in this week's matchup. Now, coming in as my wide receiver 32, this is where I'm going to put Rashee Shaheed for the New Orleans Saints. They play on the road at the Atlanta Falcons, and Shaheed, he didn't log any receptions on the 5 targets that he received in Sunday's 15-12 defeat to the Eagles. That being said, Shaheed's target share didn't see any sort of dip here on Sunday. Instead, the Saints offense as a whole just cooled off, as I mentioned before. Now, that being said, Shaheed, he had a chance at another long touchdown in this one. He just didn't come down with the football. He's going to be looking to bounce back here this week against the Atlanta Falcons. Now, coming in at my wide receiver 33 on the week, here's where I'm going to put Khalil Shakir for the Buffalo Bills. He gets to play a game this week here against the Baltimore Ravens, and Shakir, he caught all 6 of his targets for 72 yards and a touchdown in Monday's 47-10 win over the Jaguars. He has quietly been one of the most consistent receivers in this Buffalo Bills offense, and he looks to be emerging as Josh Allen's new wide receiver 1 here in 2024. He should have another good matchup here this week against the Ravens, as I mentioned, and in week 4, I think this is going to be one of the higher scoring matchups of the week, meaning there could be a lot of fantasy points to go around, so Shakir should definitely be in your lineups, at least as a wide receiver 3. Now, coming in at my wide receiver 34 on the week, here's where I'm going to put Rome Odunze of the Chicago Bears. They do get to play against the Los Angeles Rams, and Odunze, he caught 6 of 11 targets for 112 yards and a touchdown in Sunday's 21-16 loss to the Colts. Odunze's role is continuing to grow here in Chicago, and his chemistry with Caleb Williams is continuing to grow as well. There should be a chance to add on to that here in a week 4 performance against the Rams, who currently rank 31st against fantasy football wide receivers. Now, coming in as my wide receiver 35 on the week, here's where I'm going to put Christian Kirk of the Jacksonville Jaguars. As I mentioned, they played the Houston Texans, and last week, Kirk secured 8 of 10 targets for 79 yards in the Jaguars' 47-10 loss to the Bills. Kirk, he led the way for the Jacksonville Jaguars in all receptions, receiving yards, and targets, and that was a major change of pace from the first 2 weeks where Kirk's usage just wasn't the same. That being said, week 3, the usage is more of what we expected when we drafted him coming into the season, and I think he's going to continue to build upon that here in week 4 against the Houston Texans. And now, last but not least, coming in as my wide receiver 36, this is where I'm going to put Michael Pittman Jr. of the Indianapolis Colts. He gets a tough matchup this week against the Pittsburgh Steelers, and last week, Pittman caught 4 of 5 targets for 36 yards in Sunday's 21-16 win over the Bears. However, through 3 weeks, Pittman, he has failed to ever crack the top 50 wide receivers on any given week. Anthony Richardson, he continues to look inaccurate on these shorter passes, and Pittman is borderline benchable in week 4 in a very tough matchup against the Pittsburgh Steelers. So there you have it. That is my top 36 wide receivers right now going into week 4 of the fantasy football season. As I mentioned, the running back version of this video is going to be coming out later today. So if you enjoyed today's video, make sure you go hit that like button. And if you want to catch the running back version and all future videos on this channel, make sure you hit the subscribe button as well. Last but not least, these rankings are going to change and update throughout the week. If you want to see the updates as they come in, as they happen, make sure you go join my Discord. In my Discord is where I will be able to answer any fantasy football questions from you and give you all of those answers as these rankings get updated. It is free to join. There is no risk in doing that, and that will be linked in the description. But with all of that being said, I have nothing else for you guys today, so I will see you on our next episode. Until then, peace out.